Welcome to another episode of the Gamer's Garden, and in this video we're looking at a duo of futuristic racing games on the PS1. In 1993, Sony completely bought out Psygnosis, the publishing/development studio that had been enjoying success across a wide range of formats since its creation in 1984, most notably with Shadow of the Beast and the infamous Lemmings. Sony needed some push for its upcoming PlayStation, and with Psygnosis, they got both a dev and a publisher that knew how to keep their finger on the pulse of Western gamers with their distinctly European flavour. At the same time, attention to detail, a small British development studio, were releasing some infamous games of their own, although for the wrong reasons, on Atari's lackluster Jaguar. But at the end of the 90s, these two companies would come together when Psygnosis picked up the small studio's Rollcage, when the PS1 zeitgeist was at its absolute highest point. By 1999, the PlayStation had pretty much swept all competition aside. Sega's Saturn had been defeated in its early years, and coming a bit later, Nintendo's 64 could never quite stack up to the numbers sold, even with its famous genre-defining library. Such was Sony's success that even the next gen had to be brought forward, with Sega gearing up to bring its new super console, the Dreamcast, to the West in September that year. One studio that was riding this wave of success was Psygnosis, a pack leader who spearheaded the PlayStation's early years in Europe and the US with the standout Wipeout games and other hits like G-Police, Destruction Derby and the official Formula 1 games, and in March they published attention to detail's Rollcage. Conceived during an intense night playing Sega Rally, the game's designers imagined a racing game where the player was kept in the thick of the action at all times, using indestructible vehicles that could smash through entire buildings to keep this level of excitement high. Inspired by the 90s trend of RC cars with oversized wheels allowing them to work both sides up, Wrecked on Speed was born, and after pitching an early build to various publishers, Psygnosis picked it up and named it Rollcage. Rollcage clearly borrows from Wipeout, with the focus on the weight and physics of its vehicles alongside the range of weapons, feeling like a kind of sister game. Rollcage has its own ideas though, and it's mainly the central gimmick of its cars. You can ride up walls, ceilings and ramps at incredible speeds, and if you fall off with the right amount of skill, you can land either side up and keep going. It can be easy to end up pointing the wrong way before you become adept to the controls, but a quick press of circle puts your car the right way and off you go. There are 2 weapon slots for the standard range of pickups like rockets, missiles and boosts, and coupled with the indestructible nature of your car, they can be a weapon themselves. Most tracks have a variety of buildings, and ploughing into one fast enough can bring it crashing down on your opponents. There are 20 tracks across 4 different environments, and although this is a lot more than the Wipeout games at the time, Rollcage's ones are quite short and generally oval shaped, so they don't stand out quite as much. They all have a degree of interactivity though, and destroying billboards and towers brings an exhilarating feel to the racing that really separates Rollcage from the other futuristic racing games of the time. Arriving in '99 with the PlayStation deep into its shelf life, attention to detail were able to produce a visually superb game, although the console's infamous texture warping and a liberal use of dithered textures are on show here and they don't look fantastic on modern TVs. Rollcage's aesthetic follows the more muted colour palettes and industrial design of Wipeout 1, rather than the rising Japanese influence on 2097 and Wipeout 3, so it has a distinctly European feel. Attention to detail also made the frame rate a priority from the start of development, feeling it to be crucial in this kind of racing game, and so programmed a dynamic modelling technique that uses fewer polygons as objects are further into the background. The frame rate feels solid and there's little to no pop-up, and this is very impressive considering the effects on the show. Destructible environments and explosions are mixed in with extensive lighting effects, environmental effects and motion blur that must push the PlayStation near its limits. The racing is accompanied by a fast-paced soundtrack of contemporary electronica with the likes of Fatboy Slim and Aphrodite on the track list, and it provides another point of comparison to the Wipeout series. Overall, the production values of Rollcage add up to a seriously impressive looking and sounding game for its console and time of release. With a big marketing push, particularly in the UK's official PlayStation magazine, Rollcage was high profile, but it didn't sell the numbers Sony expected. Launching a new IP is always difficult, and 1999 was a huge year for the PlayStation, with Tony Hawk's, Final Fantasy VIII, Driver, Ape Escape, Medal of Honor, Resident Evil 3, Silent Hill, the list just goes on and on. It was always going to be tough to stand out, particularly as Psygnosis released their own Wipeout 3 just a few months after Rollcage, effectively cannibalising some of its sales. Despite all this, Rollcage was still very well received, and attention to detail immediately began work on a sequel, Rollcage Stage 2, that released a little over a year later in 2000. Stage 2 feels a lot more like DLC does now rather than a full-blown sequel, and it's very much a refinement of the original game. A lot has been improved and tweaked though, and far more features added to increase the game's longevity. The main improvements are in the car handling and physics, where Rollcage felt lighter and more floaty, resulting in some unwanted changes in direction. Stage 2 has weightier cars with sharper steering. The camera has been subtly improved as well, pointing more towards the direction of the track, the more likely a crash is, and the opponents are easier to attack and less likely to just plough through you or your weapons. There are far more ways to play the game that focus to different degrees on the racing and combat. A lot more tracks, and weapons can now be stacked and combined to create 24 different combinations. It's like a turbo version of the first game, and the more drum and bass soundtrack accompanies this work. The visuals are pretty similar, but that's no bad thing considering how great they already look, and when it all comes together in the heat of a race, the audio-visual character of Rollcage Stage 2 is fantastic. Although again a very technically accomplished game on the world's most successful console, Rollcage Stage 2 didn't set the world alight, and in mid-2000 gamers already had their hearts set on the next generation of consoles. Perhaps if development had shifted to be a launch PlayStation 2 game, things would have been different, but Stage 2 proved to be the last entry in attention to detail's short-lived series. Both games also saw release on PC, as Psygnosis enjoyed some freedom to publish on other platforms even though they were wholly owned by Sony, but this was the last time they would work with attention to detail, and Stage 2 was one of the last games they published before being rebranded as Studio Liverpool and exclusively developing on future Sony platforms. Attention to detail would have one more stab at their racing concept with Firebugs in 2002, geared more towards younger gamers as the PS1 was repositioned later in its life cycle. This was basically Rollcage repackaged, and it came out far too late to make much of an impression and was only released in Europe. A handful of Rollcage's original developers also released a spiritual successor in 2018 called Grip after a failed Kickstarter campaign. Grip saw release on all the main platforms, but it didn't review that well, so may prove to be the last we see of this kind of racing for a while. Rollcage was both a benefactor and a sort of victim of the PlayStation's success. Such was the popularity of the console that many games saw the light of day that perhaps wouldn't today in an effort to satisfy the console's huge audience. This was fantastic for the PlayStation's library, as it still stands as probably the most varied of all time, but some of the individual games themselves fell off the radar due to the sheer flood of top quality titles. Rollcage is absolutely iconic in terms of what the PlayStation was doing at the time, even if the game itself isn't such an icon. Thanks for watching, and tell me in the comments if other games you like slip beneath the waves of the PlayStation's popularity. Have a look at my other videos for more things like this, and until the next time, happy gaming.